I want to thank the National Security College for their invitation today, and I really look forward to the panel session with this very experienced group of panellists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chrissy, and what an incredible way to introduce this panel. I'm Jennifer Westacott. We could not be better served than this panel we have in front of us this afternoon. In terms of this important consultation, these are the leaders of our national security architecture. Let me introduce them. Obviously, you've met Chrissy Barrett, and I won't repeat your bio. I won't go through the bios because we want to get into the conversation. Hamish Hansford, who's the Head of National Security in the Department of Home Affairs, also serving as the Commonwealth Counter-Terrorism Coordinator and the National Counter-Foreign Interference Coordinator. Justin Hayhurst, Deputy Secretary, International and Security Group, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, former Ambassador to Japan, and a very, very prestigious career across multiple jurisdictions and security settings. Lieutenant General Simon Stewart, AO, DSC, Chief of the Australian Army, with 38 years of experience in operational command, and the Commander of Forces in a number of very complex and difficult theatres, including Timor-Leste and Afghanistan, and Jeff Pope, AM. Jeff is the Federal Electoral Commissioner, a long-standing and highly prestigious leader of the Australian Electoral Commission. Can you please make them all welcome? So this is a huge body of work, and you've heard a lot about it today. Dramatic shifts in a temporal sense, dramatic shifts across demography, communities really prioritising safety and peace, perceptions of national threats to security, and a very big demographic lens in terms of the perceptions of young people. What the report shows, though, is how important Australians' views are. The voice of Australians, not the voice of the commentariat. The interconnected and cumulative nature of shocks and factors that are impacting on people's sense of security and well-being. The role of economic well-being in people's overall sense of security. Now, we'll explore these issues, things like resilience, supply chain, preparedness, sovereign capability, coordination, and social cohesion. But in particular, we want to crucially focus on information, communication, and how we build trust. So let me go to the first question, and maybe start with you, Chrissy, given you've just made those very important remarks. I want everyone to just go through their top reaction when they looked at these documents. What are the top things that really stood out to you?
Thank you. Look, can I firstly just say, and I alluded to this in my speech, that I really see this as the pulse of the nation and in such a critical time. And to have a survey that actually, gives us insights into three distinct moments in time over the last couple of years when we've seen how rapidly the environment has changed, it really does give us a rich insight into not only what is the community thinking and what are they concerned about, but I hear from this survey permission for us to talk more openly, more transparently, and as I said, not sugarcoat, plain language, because I take from this that the community is up to hear, the challenges and in more detail. So for me, the richness of this survey actually shapes how I communicate and how the AFP communicates and engages with the community, how we respond, how we prioritise our engagement and the work that we do. And I think some of the takeaways for me were seeing that, my first initial response is we've got a very smart, savvy community. Their finger is on the pulse. And, to see a community that's linking things like housing affordability, cost of living pressures with national security, yep. I think, gives us some comfort that, as I said, we've got a very smart community. Particularly, current day, we look at what's happening with fuel prices and the cost of living pressures. So, that was pleasing for me to see. And I think, the safe and peaceful communities part, that means so many different things. But to know that that's what communities are looking for helps in how I leverage that to have some of those hard conversations in a way that the community's ready to hear them, I think.
Absolutely. Hamish, your reaction to the report?
Yeah, one of my reactions was that national security is deeply personal. The fact that Over 20,000 people took the survey. Over 300 people were engaged. 64% of people are worried about national security. And a bit like Chrissy, the deeply personal response to some of the economic security issues, it really does demonstrate that security is taken seriously and deeply personally by a whole range of Australians. So that was the key insight that I had in reading the report.
Justin.
Thank you. They're terrific reports, actually. I mean, I read a lot of articles about a lot of security and international issues, but I hadn't really... It gave me a new perspective on some things. So that's valuable in its own right, and it's grounded in a lot of data. Look, three things I was really struck by. One of them is the anxiety about Australia's connections to the world, and even within Australia. So at a time of disruption, how ordinary life and community safety can be affected. And we're seeing some of that in response to supply chain issues emanating from the current war in the Middle East. The second thing that really struck me was the unsurprising emphasis on the polluted information environment, linked to the point about communication. I mean, I do think sometimes the jargon and the vocabulary of national security is abstract and alienating for ordinary people. What this report does is ground all of our conversations in what people really think affects them, and in plain English ways. So I think that's something to think about, and it probably underscores the valuable role that the National Security College can play. So I want to think a bit about interdependence, communication, and then just lastly, sometimes you might read an opinion piece that suggests Australia as a nation is quite complacent. This report, I think, has an insight into a community that actually isn't complacent. It's actively thinking about how a less benign world might affect them and their communities and their families. So it's very impressive work. That's my main point.
And it's interesting that, it's interesting to hear from the Australian community rather than the commentariat, because the insight and common sense that people have, particularly when you read some of the comments, it's really refreshing, I think.
I agree, 100%.
Simon, your reaction to the report?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Look, my initial reaction was that this is entirely unsurprising.
Right.
I have the privilege of getting around to communities. Our Army's in 157 locations across the depth and breadth of our nation. So the conversations and the discussions that I'm privileged to have with Australians all around our country, to me, really... there was nothing surprising here. Two thoughts. One, I thought a very timely diagnostic, and great credit to Rory and the team here at the NSC, who, in my view, are leaders in a respectful contest of ideas. And I think a longitudinal approach to this will be very, very useful to help us see ourselves. I think for me, there were more questions arising from this work, and that's why I think a longitudinal approach is absolutely worthwhile. They fall into two categories: framing and context. And if you'll just indulge me for a moment, framing, what do we mean by national security? And I think there's some wonderful work here to define this in an Australian context, because of course the concept of national security finds its origins in US domestic politics in the late 30s, early 40s, and FDR's New Deal, and it was latterly applied to geopolitics, which set up the guns versus butter binary. So I think this actually provides the start, at least, of our ability to frame this in an Australian context, and to look at whether we can move beyond the binary. Because I think the obvious answer is and, not or. And then the second one, in terms of context, the context, of course, is a great power, in an era of great power competition, which is the historic norm. We've been living in an historic anomaly in the last sort of 4 or 5 decades. And while that competition defines the context, the idea of middle power agency is not a new one. You can go back to the Peloponnesian Wars where the Megarians and the Corinthians were able to influence against the great powers of the day in Athens and Sparta. So the question, of course, then is so what? And I think where we find ourselves nationally, and I think it's borne out in the evidence presented here, is that in an era of great power competition, national security is once again a national endeavour, as opposed to the so-called wars of choice, where that wasn't an immediate demand on us as a nation. So there's a whole of government effort and a whole of nation effort, and I think our challenge, along with every other nation in this competition, is to get match fit and to do it pretty quickly. And the final point I'd make, and I think it's probably already evident to people like Rory and our tertiary sector across the country, that in terms of statecraft, grand strategy, there's hardly what you describe as a canon of scholarship in our country on these really important aspects. So I think there's some great opportunities there for further work.
Fantastic. And your point about longitudinal, I think, Rory, is a really important one, because the temporal kind of span of the report is quite short, and it'd be good to see, over a decadal kind of approach, how that plays out. You're the electoral commissioner responsible for our democratic institutions. Talk to us, Jeff, about your reaction to the report. What really stood out for you?
Thanks, Jennifer, and look, also my congratulations to the National Security College. It's a fantastic report, and so a few things. I mean, it's very clear, obviously, that people want safe and peaceful communities and protect their normal way of life, and that certainly made me reflect on and underscore just how important it is to have strong and trusted democratic elections to help enable those peaceful communities and the normal way of life. I was really pleased to see that 23% of the participants also had the priority of democratic rights and freedoms. That's really encouraging, and obviously I reflect on the role of federal elections in that context. I did note, I think the demographic of that 23% was more older Australians, so it raised a bit of a question therefore about the younger Australians, and I see plenty of other research that indicates it's not that younger Australians don't prioritise democracy or elections or our democratic freedoms. I think they're just overwhelmed with a whole variety of challenges, and particularly the economic challenges and security potentially. But it's just one to watch, and again, that longitudinal study will be really important. Obviously, I was also really pleased about social cohesion being something that Australians want to see protect and invest. And of course, it made me reflect that, federal elections is probably the largest social cohesion exercise that Australia undertakes every 3 years, where we all come out as equals, do the same activity, it all has the same value. And here in Australia, of course, we trust that process, we trust the result, and we do it in an environment that's almost festival-like. We've got a winning formula here in Australia, and it's something that we can and we are in many ways exporting to the world. But federal elections, well delivered, are a great social cohesion exercise. And probably last, I might just reflect on the Indigenous report for a moment also, because I noted that the information environment finding there was starting to cause a bit of a growing sense of disaffection, and that also just caused me to reflect that we see that disaffection in some Indigenous enrolment rates and turnout in Indigenous communities, and clearly there's more work to be done there. So the information environment might be one of many causal factors, but it was just something for me to reflect on.
Terrific. I want to ask all of you about how you see the top risks playing out over time. But Chrissy, let's start with you and the comments you made in your speech. You talked about crime as a service and criminal convergence, which is, I think, something that really made me sit up and think about those interconnections. I mean, how do you think about policing now as a service, given that complexity of that environment, and how do you systematise a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been the commissioner just coming up to 6 months now, and it's caused me to really reframe and reform the AFP as an organisation, seeing what we've been seeing in the threat environment over the last couple of years. And obviously I spoke to some of that in my speech, but, from top down, it's a new mission statement for the organisation. It's clearly calling out the AFP as a national security agency. And I think just the point that Simon made earlier, that's a reframing of what are we talking about when we say national security. So for the AFP now, that's not just our traditional counterterrorism and espionage, foreign interference. It's cyber, it's drug importations that are looking to threaten our region and our country. It's nearly everything we do has a national security nexus to it. So new mission statement, it's new priorities for the organisation, which I've set very clearly since becoming commissioner. It's a restructure of how we actually organise ourselves internally. So as I alluded to in my speech, we have now brought our crime and our counter-terrorism areas back together because, strictly because of that convergence that we're seeing and needing to be joined up a lot more internally. It goes to governance.
Yeah.
It definitely goes to accountability. So how, as a leader of the organisation, am I holding my organisation and my members accountable to a new mission, new priorities? I mean, it is, it is a big cultural thing to shift. And I think, underscoring all of that are two really important things. It's communication. So how do I communicate with my own workforce around this shift and the why? Like, why are we restructuring and reprioritising? Stakeholders, so assuring stakeholders that, we're not walking away from anything. In actual fact, this will make us stronger and more impactful in the environment. The community. So that communication, as I talked about, this research gives us fantastic insights into the language that we use and how do we lay those breadcrumbs to build that confidence with the community. So communication and also underscored by trust. There's got to be trust. And, as a very high profile institution, we have to be able to build that trust with the community. And it goes back to the comments I made earlier. That means that I've got to speak openly and transparently and find those connection points. We've got to engage more. We all know that, policing is a team sport. We cannot solve these problems on our own. So we need to lean in more around how do we bring community in, community groups, community leaders, how do we take some calculated risks around sharing information both ways and working a lot more closely together. So it has been a big 6 months for the organisation. I think, the benefit that I had is that I had been the Assistant Commissioner of Counterterrorism and Special Investigations. I was then the Deputy Commissioner for National Security leading into my commissionership. So I sort of comment that, I had a real front row sort of role from October 7, 2023 onwards. So I felt that, moving into the commissioner's position, I knew where the organisation needed to go. Yep. We are on a journey, obviously. It's a big cultural shift, as I talked about, but the evidence is there in the caseload that we've had and the threats that we're facing and combating. It is absolute necessity that we are moving with the times and ensuring we're fit for purpose.
And hopefully this report and this community consultation helps you drive that culture and systemic change.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, it's, you're hearing first voice from the community and some of the insights in there. And again, as I said, I feel like it is actually giving us permission to be more upfront and have those conversations that perhaps, we haven't had so explicitly previously.
Hamish, from your perspective, how do you see some of these risks playing out that if you stand back and you look at the kind of risks that people went through, how do you see them playing out? And in the world that you're operating in, counter-terrorism, how do you start to kind of think about the kind of views of the community as you start to frame up your responses?
I think it was very telling that artificial intelligence was the highest result. And I think that's the human nature to grapple with new things, both personally but institutionally as it's rolled out across organisations. And that kind of got me to thinking about your question, which is what are the threats that really make me stay awake at night? And the first one relates to the online environment from a cyber perspective. Australia hasn't had a catastrophic cyber attack. And we've had lots of data breaches, lots of consequential cyber incidents, but nothing that has fundamentally ground component parts of society to a halt.
Yep.
And if you see what is happening with ransomware actors in the UK with Jaguar Land Rover, that's profoundly impactful and I think heading our way. So I think that's behind the top result on artificial intelligence and the cyber environment. You then pick up on some of Chrissy's points about state threat actors and other actors and their influence online. We don't know the transparency of algorithms for social media applications in many cases. So the online information that we see, we don't know who the actors are behind that information and how that's influencing a whole range of society. And then on the counterterrorism front, we're seeing a lot of young individuals, particularly young men, engaging in violent extremist material online. Even when we do some of our pilots, the amount of people who click on referral links is larger than we thought it would be. In the first 7 days of the pilot we ran in January, we saw hundreds of people diverting themselves. So that's a worrying online trend, particularly for people who live largely in the online environment and then come out into communities. So how do we bridge that divide, let alone the level of debate, and I'm sure Jeff sees it in some election discussions, the level of debate online, which is challenging our cohesion as a society, because a lot of people say a lot of things online they wouldn't do in their private lives. So that's what really sticks out to me in terms of threats that we're still grappling with.
So Jeff, I'll go to you then, because just to pick up those points about the risk of disinformation and obviously the big risk of social media and artificial intelligence being extraterritorial. In other words, they know no boundary. How do you see this playing out in your world and playing out over time? I mean, you must be concerned about the interaction of social media and artificial intelligence on the integrity of the electoral commission, the electoral system, really.
We absolutely are, and we have been for a while, and mis and disinformation is one of many threat vectors to electoral integrity. And we recognised that quite a while ago, and we've been trying to deal with that as best we possibly can. Although it is challenging for the reasons that you point out, Jennifer. I mean, we can't regulate social media companies. We don't have jurisdictional authority over social media companies. I think the first thing we had to do was we actually had to identify what is our lane, what's our area of expertise and authority and influence. And whilst many people want to drag us into truth in political advertising and being the internet police and being the truth police of the whole election campaign, our lane is actually just about mis and disinformation as it relates to the electoral process. We're the experts in that, we have the authority in that, and we have the capacity to deal with that, and we've developed that capacity. So we've had to do an awful lot, and it was pleasing to see that 73% of the respondents recognise that mis and disinformation was a significant threat. It is, I think, increasingly becoming more so now with the unknown impact of what artificial intelligence can do to the velocity of mis and disinformation. We've done an awful lot internally with our capability. We've got a social media team that is forward-leaning with a high risk appetite, doesn't have to go through bureaucratic processes to manage our social media channels. We have pre-bunking and debunking videos, over 100 of them with our experts. We've engaged with social media companies to try and make sure that they do enforce a few rules that are left with respect to moderating. So we really do push out positive messages. We've got a disinformation register where we call out mis and disinformation. But it's the unknown of artificial intelligence, and the equation for us now is humans are pretty good at countering humans, but how are we going to go at countering machines? And I think we now need to think about how we're going to invest in that capability.
Simon, just go to you in terms of how you think some of these risks are going to play out and the ones that you're particularly concerned with. And I just wanted you to expand a little bit more on this concept of rethinking national security in an Australian context.
Sure. We obviously responsible in part for the military element of national power, and our focus is largely on external threats to Australia's interests, both from promoting them, but also in terms of protecting them. I would say our thinking and our acting is probably well advanced, given the Defence Strategic Review that was commissioned by the government in its first term, which really, for us, captured the essence of the military problem, but in a national context. And of course, the strategy of deterrence by denial has a whole range of implications for us. But generally speaking, as military professionals, we're dealing with 4 key challenges simultaneously that are not so much unique to the times, but certainly characterise the times. One is the timeless balance between war's enduring nature and its ever-changing character. And that is always a challenge in terms of balancing, because in every interwar period in our history and broader history, there's always been an imbalance towards changing character and the dominance of technology. The temporal dimension, time is not on our side, and technology has the effect of compressing time, but also geography. So in other words, the geometry of what we're dealing with is really quite different. So what? So I'll speak just from an army perspective, but we are undergoing one of the most significant transformations of our army, your army, since the Second World War. And if I can condense it, the big idea is continual adaptation. And why? Because warfare has always been a contest to see who can adapt the fastest and the most effectively. And of course, if there's one thing that's unique to our current times as distinct to other generations, I think it's probably the pace of change, which can be, which I think is, to the points that have been made, one of the things that creates anxiety is the pace of change. We've taken a very comprehensive approach to that. We've rewritten our concepts that describe how we operate, how we fight. We've changed the way we're organised and the command relationships, the command and control. There's a huge investment in delivering capability and doing that more quickly. But importantly, we've also sought to renovate and reset the foundations of our culture.
Yep.
And without that, to be honest, the rest is really not going to be well anchored. We've re-engineered our operating system so it is fit for purpose to meet the tempo of the day and help us to see ourselves better and make quicker decisions. A big focus on integration, not just with ourselves in the military, but with our partners in the national security space, but importantly, a new relationship with industry when it comes to depth and resilience and in things like supply chain, but also a much more integrated partnership with industry and the academy to ensure that well before we sort of, put money on the table, we've collaborated to figure out the art of the possible and how we might do it in a way that benefits everybody, but gets the job done. And then 2 final points. One is the way that we are training, educating and experiencing our people, our human capital, has undergone a pretty significant change as well, and very much taking an effectiveness over an efficiency model to try and design out some of the fragility that has come from a just-in-time efficiency model. And the final point, set 4 priorities when I started in 2022. The premise inter pares of those is trust. Trust in our own teams, trust with the society we exist to serve, trust with the government of the day, trust with our allies and partners, and trust with our industry and academic partners. That might sound like a sort of an esoteric thing, but it actually matters. And trust is built slowly, in my experience. But it's about transparency. And that's why the new relationships, particularly with industry, are so important in actually meeting the challenges of the day.
Absolutely. We'll come back to trust. Justin, just your perception of how these risks will play out. I mean, you're dealing with a lot of issues, no doubt. When you and I talked about this yesterday around maritime, supply chain. How do you see the big risks playing out?
Thank you, Jennifer. I mean, this conversation, like the report, is quite grounded in our domestic cohesion and resilience. So I think it's important to note that as a foundation upon which Australia can engage with the outside world and seek advantage for its people through that engagement. I do think that the overwhelming reality for Australia is that our outside environment is much less benign than it used to be.
For sure.
It doesn't mean Australia isn't a success story. We've probably never been more prosperous or globally connected through cyber and other systems, but that outside environment, both the way power is, the way power is organised and exercised, the rules of the road, the erosion of some long-standing institutions, rules and systems, all of that makes it a much more complicated environment to navigate. As an island nation, somewhat distant from key markets, both for our own products and the things we need to import, things that we've always taken for granted, like stable and open oceans, for example, that requires a lot more careful thought. It requires greater investment in capability. It also requires, I think, a real emphasis on our international partnerships where there is trust with another government with similar objectives and the capability to shape that environment. So there's big demands through all of that. I do think at a time like the current one, where, despite our massive and influential energy partnerships across the world, we do have an import reliance on fuels. A lot of other countries depend on what we send them. So we have to keep thinking hard about interdependence. Interdependence can be a vulnerability if people exploit it against you or you're not prepared for some of the volatility that interdependence entails. But interdependence can also work for you when you have partnerships and you have a government that is seen as extremely trusted. And I think one thing about the current environment is Australia's value proposition as a partner for other countries has actually never been higher.
Absolutely.
So while there's a lot of risks to manage, there are big opportunities to offset those risks through what Australia can bring as a partner. So, I think, there's so many things to think about, but just in all of that, the key, I think, for the nation and for all the jurisdictions of government, state, local, and of course Commonwealth, is to think about being prepared for foreseeable risks, but to work that interdependence very hard. So isolationism and thinking of self-reliance as a panacea for some of these risks, it's not going to work because we won't be able to do it. Of course, in some areas, we will have to be much more self-reliant than we are now. But actually, we're about reliance through trusted networks and supply chains much more. And that's not an economic efficiency proposition. It's a national judgment about the balance between efficiency, security, risk, and community confidence. So all of that's going to play out. And there's a lot of big things and abstract concepts, but I think people are looking for greater confidence that Australia can connect securely to the outside world. So I think about those things sometimes.
Well, I hope you do, given your role. If you're not thinking about them, we should be all kind of worried. I'm the government's business champion to Indonesia. So just to pick up on your point, the way the country is seen by some of our closest neighbours is so important. Like the relationship between us and Indonesia could not be better. It could not be in a better shape. And it's such an important strategic relationship. So I'll stay with you, Justin, and ask everyone the same question as well. What do you see as the role of the Commonwealth in its leadership capacity in the context of this whole of nation engagement and cooperation between government, the private sector, the community? And given that we do still have at all levels of government, but the Commonwealth in particular, a quite siloed approach to how we manage this. What do you see as the kind of new role or the kind of refined role of the Commonwealth, given the kind of report that we've got in front of us today?
I think on the issue of connecting with the world, whether it's through our defence strategy or foreign policy, clearly the Commonwealth is in the lead. But the current crisis is a good illustration of the way the Commonwealth can and does coordinate between jurisdictions. I mean, in some ways, this crisis has a few dimensions. It's got a security dimension,
Yep.
It's got a consular dimension, and it's got a supply chain, domestic, well-being, economic and otherwise dimension. And all across the Commonwealth and states, there are networks connecting to businesses and communities, but how do you bring it all together? The Prime Minister has done that through the mechanisms he chairs. Hamish is chair of, or co-chair of the National Coordination Mechanism, which is a way for rapid information sharing between Commonwealth and state governments and the identification for risk and response. Those meetings continue. That they sort of have there's an energy channel and a broader security conflict social cohesion channel. I think COVID, including through the creation of National Cabinet and other things, created new ways of working to deal with what are in effect cross-jurisdictional responses within Australia for international problems that occur or emanate from outside Australia. So the key, I think, for coordination, and something that in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet we're aware of, is we haven't got the expertise or the resources to run everything. It's to try and knit together the system and identify gaps and let the experts run the issues. So if you're worried, for example, about fertiliser to supply to Australia in advance of harvest season, you need the agriculture ministries in our jurisdictions to run that and engage with business. But somebody has to link that to the other issues you might be concerned about, supply of fuel, whatever it might be. So I think in a federation in particular, the problem of coordination and the priority of coordination has been an enduring preoccupation. I'm fairly new to my role, but I'm pretty confident in saying that I think we're getting better at it. But it's got to be worked at all the time. And at the moment in crisis, things kick into gear very quickly. The issue of preparedness requires a different kind of tempo of work, but the problem of coordination remains, well, it'll be the difference between national success and its alternative.
And I think as part of that, I think finding ways of working with industry. I was running the Business Council during COVID, and it was magnificent actually to see the way people worked with industry, the way people just got into autopilot about communicating, solving problems in real time. So I think there are some lessons and structures that we're obviously going to count on again as we go through this crisis.
Agree again, absolutely. And the supply chain disruptions we're facing require this partnership between business and government. That's the only way the nation can navigate the difficulties ahead.
Hamish, your view about the role of the Commonwealth here. You've obviously got these very important coordinating roles.
I think the Commonwealth is effectively maintaining a giant risk register for the nation, because truly if the government often says that security is the first responsibility of the government, only a Commonwealth government can really truly understand the extent and scope of the risk. Doesn't mean that the Commonwealth then does risk mitigation, but it effectively looks at what are all the risks we have and how do we partner with industry like we've done over the last 20 years on critical infrastructure security. Do we need to legislate or regulate? Do we need to pull that lever for a market failure? To what extent do we need to do that? Do we need to look at stockpiles like we did during COVID? What needs to be the most highest priority? How do we partner with states and territories, which are the governments on the front line of many service delivery issues? So I think the role of the government is to look across all of those different risks and say, where do we invest? Where do we think about partnerships? Where do we think about looking at funding issues, noting that government doesn't have endless funding? And I think the report really does demonstrate all of those types of risks that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Under the Commonwealth's approach, though, is the institutional knowledge of the public service. And I think, a bit like Justin's point, we often think about responding to crises, but the institution of the public service has to be there for the long term and build up long-term capability to think about preparedness, to think about what are the different types of things that we need to perhaps exercise today that we might be dealing with in 5 and 10 years' time, and particularly acute, I suppose, in the military sense. But the same thing goes for any domestic security issue that we face.
Chrissy, going to you, I mean, you're running the federal agency, but a lot of the issues you talked about in your speech are going to be picked up by your state colleagues. You know, criminals conducting, if there's such a word as normal crime, such 2 words, who may be acting for state actors and this criminal kind of service that you talked about. I mean, how are you thinking about coordination in that context?
Yeah, look, I think our joint constructs between the AFP, other state and territory law enforcement, and of course ASIO and other Commonwealth agencies have never been more important for that exact reason. As I spoke about, there's no longer a direct line from criminal to criminal act, and what might appear to be something on face value could be far more sinister than what anyone can see right before them. So our joint organised crime task forces, our joint counter-terrorism teams, our joint anti-child exploitation teams, very well practiced, very well tested, very mature constructs. I think that the unique role that the AFP plays in law enforcement is that we have the bigger picture. You know, we are an international organisation, we're a domestic organisation, and we're at a local level as well here in ACT through ACT policing. So we're quite unique around the world. There really is no other law enforcement agency like the AFP. So we can operate very much on a world stage, and we are, nowhere near as big as some of our international partners, but the impact that we have and the reputation and the credibility we have with international partners is incredibly strong. And for very obvious reasons around, the necessity of us sort of coordinating with our state and territory partners. We do have those international relationships. We're in over 30 countries at an international level. At a national level, I'm sitting in NSC, I'm sitting in SCONS. That's an insight that very few of my law enforcement colleagues get. So there really is a unique role for the AFP to play coordination, leading, supporting. We can do all of that depending on the scenario, and of course we do. And I'll just to touch on one of my 5 priorities that I issued as the new commissioner was supercharging our global operations. Yep, sure. So really pushing our workforce both here in Australia and our over 200 members based throughout the world. How can we be more impactful, more dynamic? How can we have, more significant disruption outcomes rather than our traditional arresting and charging? Now, that is, as I said, something that we bring to other law enforcement agencies here in Australia that they simply cannot do. So really focusing on our impact. As an agency, we can do things on a diplomatic level that, other Australian departments can't do as well. That police diplomacy, that soft diplomacy is extremely, extremely strong. And, I think particularly about the Pacific at the moment and the challenges that we have there, we are extremely well placed as a policing partner in the region to support the wider government efforts in what, is a crucial national security response.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. It's such a unique entity, what you're working with. And again, from my time in Indonesia, you can really see the impact of your organisation in sort of tackling some of those really big issues that have existed between the two countries for a long time. Jeff, your view about the role of the Commonwealth in this?
Look, thanks, Jennifer. And I think, I guess if I could summarise it maybe as continue to invest, and the Commonwealth does invest a lot. But maybe one of my reflections from the report is maybe we've got more work to do to actually inform the community about the sort of things that we already do. Like most people probably don't realise from, over 20 years, the AEC, funded by DFAT, have been providing electoral capability assistance into the Pacific.
Yeah.
DFAT are looking for us to try and expand that with the backsliding of democracy in the region. It's absolutely critical that we do. We manage the electoral roll on behalf of all state and territories, have done for a very long time. We provide the roll for every state election, just like the South Australian one on the weekend. Local government elections all comes from our data. We have the Electoral Council of Australia and New Zealand with all the electoral commissioners getting together 4 times a year to work through strategic challenges. We work closely with the private sector to deliver elections, paper, printing, advertising, postage, couriers, scanning. And the more complex elections get, the more we lean on the private sector as critical partners. And probably the one that we rely on almost every day really is the Electoral Integrity Assurance Task Force, which has now been around since 2018. It's a model that's starting to get international recognition, and it's a collaborative effort. Most of the agencies here, AFP, Home Affairs, Prime Minister and Cabinet, the National Intelligence Community, all come to that task force as a collaborative, in-kind effort where we're sharing information and intelligence about the environment in which the election is being delivered. And the role of that task force is to provide me advice as Commissioner about whether there's been any interference in the election that would have affected the result. It's a great model. It's done a great job. I think it needs to evolve, though, to keep pace with the challenges. But my reflections from the report, we do a lot across governments and a lot across nations. I think there's more we can do to inform the public to give them that level of confidence.
Yep. Simon, your view on the role of the Commonwealth, and particularly maybe pick up your earlier comment about the role of middle powers and how you see that kind of playing out in terms of improving our national security or the perceptions of national security.
In a word, the role is leadership. I'd pick up on a point that Justin made, and that is our national value proposition on the international stage and our convening power.
Yep.
Which I think is probably much greater than most Australians might imagine. So there may be a great companion piece of work that balances our own view of ourselves with how others view us, and that might give us, I think, a useful kind of bracketing of where we sit and what our convening power might deliver for us in terms of the way we see our role in the international system. In other words, what's our purpose?
Yep.
So, and I think it's really important, and it's probably the first order question for Commonwealth leadership, and that is the why.
Yep.
And calibrating across that sort of range of things that are important to Australians, just to how important they are. To use a sort of a military framework there. What are we prepared to pay for?
Yeah.
What are we prepared to fight for? What are we prepared to die for? And I think that's sort of the first order question. What's our purpose? In terms of the why, I think the term statecraft is really apt. Our foreign minister in her speech I think it was at the National Press Club 2024, she mentioned statecraft specifically about half a dozen times. So I think that's probably it in a word in terms of Commonwealth leadership. And that has, I think, 3 key elements to it. First is the vision, which is the aggregation of how we see ourselves, our place in the world, and the reciprocal discussion between our political class and Australians, those that they lead and govern, and the articulation of what it is. And that purpose, sense of purpose and articulation of purpose, I think is the point of origin here, and becomes very important when it comes to the how. The second bit is whole of government. I think everybody, all my colleagues on the panel have outlined that we've got an architecture. I think the question for us is, how do we make that architecture more malleable and more adaptable to the circumstance of the day? But I agree with my colleagues that there's a longitudinal, sort of foundational, steady state of deeper thought, planning and execution, as well as the capacity to rise to the challenge of the day. In that architecture, my personal view is that we could have a sharper focus on accountability, and then perhaps start to evolve the way the architecture works around those accountabilities. And in a simple parlance, for any given endeavour, task, crises, who's the lead, who's being supported, who are we all supporting, and who is therefore supporting. So I think it needs to be flexible. And then in terms of a whole of nation approach, that's really, I think at the Commonwealth level, it's a policy question. How do you harmonise? How do you incentivise across the range of policies? I would note that I think in our federated system, I think the role of the Commonwealth government and the Commonwealth bureaucracy and agencies is actually really quite difficult. As a West Australian, I think it's fair to say federation never really caught on in our country. And we saw that some of the practicalities and the challenges there during COVID. And sure. I'm sure Chrissy was in a similar situation, but we had soldiers on either side of a state and territory boundary behind their state police colleagues, kind of looking at each other.
Yeah.
And the final point in terms of the how, easy to say, harder to do, but and it comes back to the point about purpose. You get unity of effort through unity of purpose.
But I guess one of the challenges, and you've outlined a great set of architecture arrangements, all of you, is how do you get the community confident in that? How do you get them, you're not going to explain National Cabinet to people, although, I'm sure people understand it at one level. How do you get that confidence that people know that people are working together? Did anyone want to comment on that?
I might just quickly jump in and say ours is probably a bit easier because we employ 100,000 Australians to come and run our polling places, so they get a really good insight into our operations, which they walk away and give confidence. And they're mums and dads, brothers and sisters and neighbours. That community connection is absolutely critical to trust and to our credibility. And so I think that for us that's a great advantage.
Anyone else want to comment on how we get the community to get enough understanding and confidence that these arrangements are in place? Because clearly that information asymmetry comes across very heavily in the report. Anyone else want to comment? Justin, do you want to comment?
Well, communication can always be improved. I do think our political class, our political leaders actually do a good job. They're extremely open to the media. And I'm just struck, having returned from serving in Japan, at the way in which Australian ministers, up to the Prime Minister, make themselves available to explain these things on a day-to-day basis. Now, you can probably never communicate enough, and it's a polluted information environment, but I do think we've got something to work on there. It's an advantage, actually, of our democratic system. It's an interesting question about the public service and other institutions, whether they ought to communicate more directly as well. I pose that as a question rather than giving my...
Well, it's an interesting question because the report really differentiates the trust in you versus the trust in the political class, which is obviously a natural kind of reality, whether people like it or not. And so do you do more of that public communication and what are the opportunities to do more of that? I mean, you're obviously doing a lot of that, Chrissy, in terms of speaking directly, and you made that point about speaking in plain English and speaking in language people can understand.
Yes, I have done so many speeches since I became Commissioner. I'm sick of my own voice. It's a great opportunity, though, for, I think, people to hear directly from the Commissioner of the AFP. And I probably underestimated the power of that until I actually got in the role and started, really directly engaging with community. I think you can't replace that with media statements or, there's nothing more powerful than face-to-face connection, particularly where you've got opportunities like this to actually tease some things out and speak as vulnerably and as honestly as you can. Law enforcement is inherently difficult because you can think that you're building trust and you're having really successful outcomes, and it only takes, I guess, one incident or one media comment or, one small thing to, erode a lot of the trust you've built. We have seen, since through COVID and since COVID, anti-authority sort of sentiment, particularly focused on our state and territory colleagues. So for me, part of that is really distinguishing the AFP from state and territory police. This is what the AFP is. This is what we're here to do. This is how we go about it. But I think you can't underestimate the value of just genuine, authentic engagement.
Yep. I just want to touch briefly on policy. What do you see as the national opportunity? And I'll open this up for whoever wants to answer it. Coming out of these reports, not so much a critique of policy, but are we heading in the right direction? Are there some policy areas that we really need to get our head around? I mean, the whole question of sovereign capability, which I've spoken to a few of you about over the last couple of days, is an area of tremendous policy confusion around industry policy and what does it actually mean. Maybe start with you, Hamish, the major policy opportunity that these reports highlight.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stood out for me is that personal resilience and personal security is an area that, whilst people are engaged, the next step is for individuals to take action. And what I was thinking about in reading the report is there is a reliance on government and a reliance on some of the institutions to do everything. But Simon mentioned the world that we're going to live in, and so did Chrissy, which means that while personal resilience might be declining over time, we all need to get much better at our own resilience at a family unit, at a personal level. And if you look at some of our counterpart countries, like the French, like the Swiss, like the Swedes, like the UK, they're all putting emphasis into how do you sustain 7 days by yourself or a month by yourself at home with the right amount of food, your own sources of energy. How do you think about that? Because it might be a period of time before government comes in to assist or the private sector comes in to help. And people in bushfire areas or in cyclone areas are much more used to that. But that's a societal issue that I think if we're looking at a whole range of policies, that's a stark reminder that we're pretty much underdone on personal resilience. And how do we cascade that message? I mean, you mentioned National Cabinet and the fact that whilst people might not know the intricacies of how National Cabinet work, they feel the decisions and the cascading of messages by community leaders, by individuals, and you hear it if you.
And I think there's a confidence when people say we're having a meeting of National Cabinet.
Absolutely.
I think people do understand. People are getting their act together, and certainly now in this current crisis, but during COVID, when I was very close to this at the BCA, people really did understand that people were working together. And to your point, they could see the actions playing out. They could see things changing. They could see people responding to concerns. So I think it's a really important point.
Well, you notice it if it doesn't happen.
Exactly.
So the day after Bondi, and Chrissy was in the meeting, in a National Cabinet meeting, you see the power of comms and bringing people together.
Other policy suggestions before I move us into the final topic, before we go to questions on resilience and preparedness. Justin, any observations from your perspective? I mean, you and I talked about sovereign capability, but are there policy gaps or areas that you think where we really are going to have to kind of think that through again?
Well, I mean, there's always a lot of areas. I do think in the end, preparedness and resilience will be two key themes. I know it's the next question, but out of the report and what it reveals about the concerns of our citizens, And out of the current crisis we're in, thinking about those two things as key. Well, they're not measures, but we want to be thinking about at a personal level, community level, state level, national level, what preparedness and resilience looks like, where the main priorities will be. There will be probably a need to do some more things in Australia. That makes a lot of sense, but of course, there's no way we can do everything.
Exactly.
So we've got to think through that. Just because we do something now doesn't mean we need to do it in the future. But in some areas, as we know, Australia is world leading. So how do you maximise your advantages in those areas in ways that build your resilience, probably connected to your international network of partnerships, so the cumulative effect is greater for the Australian community. So I think they're...
Yep. But maybe it's a different frame, resilience and preparedness. It's a different policy frame to ones we've had for a long time. It's a different kind of way of looking at it. So let's go there. What might be a more proactive way of dealing with resilience and preparedness? What would that proactive model look like? So, I might start with you. You're obviously very caught up with the whole question of preparedness. How do you see this and what might be that new model, or is it about explaining the model we've got better?
Look, if I can come back to your point and question about communication in the first instance and building trust, I think most, it's a human habit to gauge your level of trust by the size of the gap between what is said and your personal experience, what is done. So I think that's an area that sort of certainly requires some work. Resilience is a multi-dimensional aspect, and we tend to focus on things, certainly at the moment about energy supplies and the like, but it's also, to Hamish's point, about societal resilience. And, for example, the strength of our civics education, the capacity for people to be able to interpret and understand the veracity of what they may be reading in however they get their news or however they're informed. From our perspective, we start with, I guess, what you might describe as strategic humility. Nobody can predict the future, and I'm always wary of people who are unduly sort of confident about how it's going to be. But we can understand the trends and and understand how those trends may combine, and then apply ourselves. There's a great book by Charles Liddell and Hal Brands called Tragedy, which is about a tragic sensibility. In other words, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And we're in the job of being professional skeptics, I think. So in doing that, it is applying that through the architecture we currently have, and focusing our coordinated efforts through practice and repetition.
Sure.
So I think that's an area where we can certainly do some more. We're already doing a lot together, but we might benefit, I think, perhaps from more frequency, and perhaps a broader set of people at the table. So I think really it's about that practice, and in demonstrating our capacity to do that, we actually contribute to our strategy of deterrence by denial, because we're demonstrating our national capacity for resilience and our national capacity for our Commonwealth architecture that supports the leadership of our government to actually do its job and to respond to the crisis of the day, but also to build the depth across society and all the physical aspects.
Jeff, how do you think about this whole question of resilience? You're running the kind of architecture of democracy it's absolutely essential to our resilience that it stays intact and obviously is modernised in the way you suggested. How do you think about this?
Look, in a number of different ways. I mean, we're currently focusing on how do we strengthen Australia's electoral literacy. And when I talk about electoral literacy, I'm talking about it very broadly so that Australians actually understand the role of elections, how to engage with elections, voting systems, preferential voting, but also, so it's civics education is critically important. But under electoral literacy is also media and digital literacy. It's a critical component. And so, I'm watching what's going on in Scandinavia very closely, particularly in Finland. They're doing a lot of work in that space and ingraining media and digital literacy, even from preschool all the way through. For them, it's an absolute investment in societal resilience. Also closely watching the European Centre for Democratic Resilience as well, which is looking at how they can defend the EU against foreign information manipulation, which is obviously a critical issue and I think an emerging issue for us in this region as well. And the UK have also got a Defending Democracy task force, which is being driven across government, including the House of Commons too, by the way. So there's areas for us to be monitoring and focusing, but it's learning, it's predicting, it's preparing, it's planning, but it's also investing.
And Chrissy, how do you think about the hallmarks of resilience? And is there a different relationship with the Australian people, a different way of thinking about, what is national service and what is serving our country and enlisting them in the kind of resilience task as opposed to saying that's really government's job, this is really the point everyone's making, this is a whole of community job?
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with the well-made points by my co-panelists. But yes, I have been taking the opportunity at a number of recent speaking engagements to start talking about, what is national service in today's times. As I said before, this is not a problem that law enforcement can solve on its own. And in fact, really trying to rally, business and particularly tech in how, what does national service look like in the private industry to support, some of the big challenges that we have ahead of us, and what does partnering with non-traditional, partners and leaning in, I think that's on law enforcement as much as it is on the private sector, taking a bit more risk, leaning in a little bit more to where we have traditionally. But this notion of, national service, it's our joint responsibility here to build the resilience and the preparedness of our country. One particular aspect to that is around our young people. So one of my 5 priorities is protecting vulnerable communities, and particularly through a lens of how vulnerable and susceptible our young people are these days to both exploitation and to radicalisation. So we need the support from industry, from tech companies, from business to tackle that problem, along with our government partners. But we see firsthand the devastating impacts of exploitation of young people, how quickly young people are being radicalised towards extremist views and violence, and our caseload speaks for itself in relation to that. So really using the platform I have to, as I said, sort of rally that national service spirit. The other aspect of resilience for me is my workforce. I'm asking my members to operate in an environment that 10 years ago, 15 years ago when they joined, even 5 years ago when they joined, these were things that we weren't doing, as a policing organisation. And, that's as much a leadership piece, a culture piece, constant communication piece, but it is absolutely a workforce that is being asked to do more and to really quickly adapt to a degrading threat environment, if we're being very honest.
Absolutely. Just briefly, Hamish, your views on what does resilience look like in the areas you're dealing with? Counter-terrorism, foreign interference. What are the kind of hallmarks of resilience in that context?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me, noting the time, and is that resilience can't be an abstract term. It's got to be tangible and specific. So resilience in a supply chain perspective, for example, and 74% of people are worried about it, actually makes governments, businesses actually say, what makes us function?
Yep.
And then how do we protect each of those different layers or have assurance? The same thing happens in foreign interference. Do we have the right settings in place, and how do we mitigate them at different layers? And I think just talking at a really abstract level, the next thing is, how do I take action?
Exactly. Justin, do you want to make any further comments on resilience and preparedness?
No, I just want to strongly endorse what Hamish has just said, and that's the opportunity during a supply chain shock.
Yep.
Is you understand much better how the supply chain works, where you need assurance, where you need redundancy, where you might need to diversify sources of supply, all of those things. So it has to move from the abstract to the concrete, absolutely.
Exactly, and then into action so that people kind of build trust around it. I'm conscious we ran out of time and you've had a very long day. I'll just ask all of you to be really very brief. So we've got 3 minutes. The one thing that you would say to people, those people who filled in the survey, who took part in the focus groups, from your perspective, that you think would assist to build confidence and trust. Jeff?
Well, for me, I think it's communication. It's communication and engagement, which has been a theme of many of my co-panellists and even questions. So we need to think about how we communicate and engage with them and build trust more. And trust is what we trade on. So that's probably the area of focus, I think.
Simon?
It's a team effort and you're part of the team.
Justin?
Just that, I think this has to be a national effort. It's not something governments can do alone. In the end, everyone has a stake in the strength and success of Australia, and that's what the government is trying to acquit, all levels of government, but everyone has to be involved.
Hamish?
Be more demanding. You're obviously engaged and highly influential to spark not only the report but our panel here today and the whole conference, so continue up the demand.
My message would be, we are your AFP. We are here to protect you. We are here to serve you. We are listening and we want to partner with you to keep you safe.
Well, I think we can see why you are trusted institutions in Australia. We've had the great privilege of hearing from our national leaders today, some of the finest public servants I think we'll ever see stage the Commonwealth organisations that they run. I think we've had a fantastic insight into and a very sophisticated discussion complementing the terrific work that Rory and the team have done. Will you join me in thanking our fantastic panel?